To everyone who is here, thank you all for tuning in. It's a very sort of futuristic way of taking down the man, which is very cool. Thank you very much again, just generally, for joining us. This is a Future Architects Front and Sarah Wigglesworth Architects partnered event as part of the broader London Festival of Architecture. Very cool sounding. And thankfully, because we're digital and we're in the age of Zoom, we're able to go beyond the physical confines of London centricity with a wide host of diverse and mixed perspectives on the critical question of education and practice, friend or foe. I am Rachel Matabe, contributor at FAF and design manager in the offsite construction field. I'll be chairing today's event, of which we have a really, really exciting lineup of agenda points, memes, and lots of sort of controversial talking points. In terms of structure, we'll begin with introductions and quick presentations, first from FAF founders Charlie Edmonds and Priti Mohandas, and then we'll pass the baton on to the rest of the panel, starting with Claire Bond from SWA. We'll be going generally in the pattern of the agenda set in some of the Instagram and other sorts of image media that we've been using. During the starting statements, please do present comments in the chat box directly, and we're trialing the Q&A function, which exists natively within Zoom. You should be able to upvote questions. So, you know, a little bit like Yak, you know, put your question in, upvote. We're going to pick some of the best and sort of most poignant questions to cover in the second half, which should be sort of really interesting as a sort of open table exercise. Although we are digital, there are some house rules. Emergency exits are to your right on the leave button or the mute button. I've written here on my little script, pause for laughter, which sucks when you don't hear the attendees.
Pause for assumed laughter.
Pause for assumed laughter, just imagined by a video. The intent of this event is, of course, to create discussion and engagement, but also in a way that we're not just the same old online event. So everybody is really, really, really encouraged to be their best extroverted selves in the comments here on social media. Generally live your best life, especially here. And also the panel members have all been asked to be punchy and to be as charming as possible for today's blind but beautiful attendees as well, who are also, I'm sure, exceptionally Zoom fatigued, as the panelists are too after a whole day of Zoom meetings, I'm sure. Lastly, we are recording this event so that people who either have been turned away at the door, figuratively, or couldn't make it today, will be watching later. So this will be memorialized in a beautiful epitaph of free culture and knowledge, which is very exciting. So with that, I will pass it on to you, Charlie and Priti. So yeah.
Great. Okay, brilliant. I will give you back your host privileges, Ration, so you can have the metaphorical power back.
Oh, thank you, boss.
Now I've fully abandoned YouTube. So yeah, thank you so much. So yeah, my name is Charlie Edmonds, and for the first sort of 5 minutes here, I'd like to do a bit of a quick brief overview of what FAF is. So I suppose the place to start is with our work at RIBA. So Ration, could you go ahead and enable the screen sharing, please? It should be in like the security button or something like that. This is what I get for giving you back the metaphorical power.
Oh man, we screwed up here. Okay, 1 second. You should be able to screen share already.
Okay, make me host again. We'll shortcut it that way.
Okay. Yes, this is very democratic and activism.
This was just a ploy for me to get the host privileges back. To be honest, I let go of it, and then I was like, no, this doesn't feel good.
Transfer of power is very natural, very important.
Okay.
Oh, that's the Trump. Host. There we go.
Brilliant. There we go. Okay, I have the power to share. Wonderful. So let's start then with who we are. So a lot of the time, when we try and create a strict definition, we end up just kind of taking the various different names that we've either been associated with or described ourselves by, and we end up just sort of saying yes to all of them for convenience's sake. And that's because at the end of the day, what we are is we are a sort of informal, quasi-political group of young people in architecture. So what have we done, I think, is probably a better way of trying to define FAF at the moment. And so the first thing that we did as a organized group was to try and look at the profession in its current state and try to understand sort of some of the areas that we thought weren't working or had some serious dysfunctionality to them. And we wanted to be relatively rigorous about this. So the first thing that we did was to release a survey all about people's experience in the profession. And so it focused on things like the level of employment, unpaid overtime, salary of architects, and feeling supported by the RIBA, for example. And this data set eventually led us, so it was about 166 responses, so not very large at this beginning stage of the work of FAF. But it was accompanied by 120 long form written experiences of people in practice. And this was where the real power of this work came from, I think, because it's one thing to sort of quantify the experiences of people in architecture, but it's a whole other thing to read through page after page after page of, in many cases, very traumatic experiences of working in the profession. And so from this initial data set, we were able to extract sort of 5 key themes, which we channeled into the form of 5 demands that we would make of the profession, and specifically RIBA, who were then sort of like the focus of our work. So they were to end unpaid overtime, to provide better oversight for the architectural assistant role, to increase transparency in RIBA's budget and spending, to instate a more representative governing body, and to have real accountability for exploitative practices. So these sort of themes, these core elements of the data that we gathered became those 5 demands, and then that went on to inform what was eventually the RIBA open letter, which was an open letter that we wrote to the Royal Institute of British Architects, which showed this data, collected the experiences of the people who spoke with us, and packaged it all up nice and neat in a few pages. Now, this was mainly a sort of powerful tool for us because it was signed by over 1,800 people. And that sort of momentum that the letter gained was fostered largely through using internet culture, things like memes, presenting a lot of the issues that we speak about in accurate but also relatable and sort of humorous ways. Maybe some people would call it lowbrow. I would say yes, but it works. So this work, along with the relevance of the topics that we were talking about, ended up leading to the letter being written about in the Architects Journal, and that in turn grew to the point where we ended up seeing the AJ actually run an entire investigation sort of from the momentum of our campaign to really forensically break down the condition of architectural assistants in the UK right now. That led to us meeting with RIBA and getting a number of commitments from them, such as committing to consult with their board to consider banning unpaid overtime in chartered practices, all the way down to including the bringing the inclusion charter into the charter practice agreement rather than something that's optional. So this entire journey kind of culminated with the work we did for RIBA. And then once we had got these commitments from them, we were wondering, okay, how do we move on from here? And that was when we started to think about education as being one of the places where a lot of these conversations first take place. And a lot of the issues that we find in architectural culture are sort of germinated. And so that's how we got to this point. That was how we got in touch with Claire and Sarah Wigglesworth Architects. And that's sort of the journey that led us to this event in a way. And so I'm going to hand it over to Pretty next to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done specifically looking at education since we finished with the work that we were doing with the RIBA. So let's see what we're going to do. I think, Pretty, is I'm just going to make you the host now. So we're going to metaphorically pass around the baton of power, I think.
In this partnership, Charlie is tech, so bear with me if I mess this up.
There you go. Your host now.
Okay.
You should be able to share.
Terrifying. Okay. Right.
There you go.
Okay, we're good to go. Fantastic.
So
I am going to put a timer on because I do not trust myself. Lovely. So my name is Pretty Mohandas and I am also a part of FAF. And today I'm going to be talking to you through the results of our recent education survey. And it's important to note that this survey came about after our talks with RIBA when it came to the unpaid overtime stuff. Everything seemed to be going back to and rooted to issues in education, starting in education. So we thought, right, let's tackle that. So the FAF education survey has reached 532 respondents and it is across 48 UK architecture schools. So those respondents are across from all these schools that you see on the screen. Now, the first few questions in the survey are all fairly evenly split. And as you can see, with regards to people's satisfaction with their experiences in architectural education, the responses, are fairly evenly split. And likewise, with regards to university teaching staff and methods, again, the responses seem to be fairly split. So here, however, you start to see biases in the results. So 55.3% said yes, that they had faced financial difficulty. But it's also worth noting that's 41.5% said no. So here, overwhelmingly, 66.2% of respondents did not believe that their education was worth the cost of their tuition. Now, that's very poignant. And 60% believe that their institutions did not value their mental health. Almost half of respondents believe that their universities valued equity, diversity, and inclusion, but it is also worth noting that a quarter did not. And almost half of respondents would not encourage a friend or a relative to study architecture. Now, moving on to life after university, overwhelmingly, 74.3% do not feel supported by their university whilst in architectural practice. And with that in mind, 92.5% believe that architectural education needs to fundamentally change. Now, what does that mean? Unlike our first survey, which was about unpaid overtime, these results are varied, they're different and they're split. And there clearly needs to be a fundamental structural change in education because a lot of people, as we've seen, do not feel supported. But we believe that this change is not a single radical solution. It's actually multiple small revolutions. It's a case for heterogeneity. It's a case for choice. and the potential for specialization, which we don't really have in our education system. So to think about this, let's look a little bit about the respondents' comments and their experiences that we gathered through this survey. So here we can see a call for less box ticking and a focus on process rather than beautiful outputs. It's what we talk about in architecture as sort of, going beyond buildings, architecture as a discipline, not just as a practice. But in education, some people feel like these are very hollow sentiments that don't play out in education as practice. The case for heterogeneity is not just in this education system, but also in terms of the professors and the tutors, and seeing diversity, not just in them, but in the way that they teach. And here we see that this person has said, fear is no longer a tactic that should be used in education. Pushing long hours, pushing energy drinks to students, that's my own personal experience of my undergrad, it's ruining young people, it's affecting their mental health. This person also calls for current agendas such as climate change to be integrated in our practice, so that we're equipped to deal with future challenges and we're equipped to deal with the challenges that face us in practice or will face us in practice. And here a student brings attention to the very male bias in architectural teaching. It's a call for more courses that explore, for example, feminism in architecture, issues around indigeneity, decolonization. Other subjects are successfully calling to decenter white Western biases in practice and to dismantle colonial legacies within their subjects. Yet in architecture, it's, for example, a course about women, to women, by women. That's how feminism or courses to do with gender in architecture seem to often play out. Diversity, inclusion, equity, they're not being mainstreamed into our practice or being mainstreamed into our education. So we're not questioning the very production of knowledge and the very practice of architecture, which is what this person seems to be calling for. And the age-old concern, get rid of the part 3, integrate it into the masters and remove the archaic PEDR. And lastly, I have missed a slide, my apologies, but I'll read this one out. I think universities need to be stricter about staff and require some level of teaching qualification, even a 2-week course. Too many studio units are led by bad architects living vicariously through their students and passing on ill-adjusted views of the profession that leave their students poorly equipped or with unrealistic expectations. This is quite a poignant one, considering what we've seen in the news as of recent. So to conclude, the evidence supports not a single revolution, but multiple small ones. We present a case for more heterogeneity and diversity in our education system that allows for specialization so that we are ready for practice. This is a pragmatic solution. It makes sense. But to overturn the deep-rooted struggles of young architects that are so embedded in our education system, we will require radicalism. It will require fight. We're questioning the very system, the unchanged system for qualification. This is not a polite request, but inherently a call to arms. Thank you.
Where's the applause button? That was awesome. Wow. Anybody else get goosebumps?
Just have to raise hands up and down.
Or just the emoji.
Yeah,
great. Okay, Pretty, I have figured out how to fix the screen sharing problem. If you would be kind enough to make me the host again.
I have no idea how to do that.
Click on the 3 little buttons if you hover your mouse over my window, and there'll be a make host button.
Oh, thank God for Charlie.
Okay, and now there we go. Wonderful. Everyone can now share. Okay, brilliant. Apologies for that interruption, Ration.
No, I was going to pass it on to Claire. After we've sort of trash talked education, I guess the next bit is how practice teaches. And I assume there's more trash talking, which I feel bad for Ming and Samita. I know that you do more teaching and you're sort of later down the line. So let's keep it going, keep it exciting. After you, Claire.
Thanks. Yeah, a bit more trash talking and keeping it lowbrow with the memes. Right, let me share my screen. Can you guys see this?
Yes.
Do I need to full screen it?
Yeah, that's great.
Is that all right? Okay, perfect. So today I'm acting as the spokesperson for our 10-strong team at SWA, and I'll be sharing, I guess, a range of experiences, observations, reflections, suggestions that came out of a recent office-wide workshop, which was exploring the theme of education in practice, friend or foe. So I'd like to caveat this presentation by saying both education and practice have their flaws. By no stretch of the imagination is practice perfect, and FAF's work to date has been excellent at highlighting that in a meaningful and actionable way. Although there were definitely some positive reflections on education within the SWA team, we ultimately concluded that we would have liked our education to have been a little bit more like practice. So for most of us, art seemed to be the only subject at school where architecture might briefly be introduced. I mean, I wonder how many people on this call thought that they had to be good at art to be a good architect, and how many teachers are still telling their students this. This specialist subject approach inevitably narrows down the pool of people who think that architecture is an option for them. Architecture is ultimately human and experienced by everyone. So why aren't buildings, our built environment, and architecture as a profession introduced across more subjects earlier on in school, like geography, history, or sociology? By keeping this tight lid on architecture through our early education, we're ultimately damaging inclusivity. Architecture becomes elitist or too complicated. And this is before we even get to the university course, where elitist attitudes are often exacerbated and the cost and nature of the course is inaccessible for many people. At SWA, in our experience, academia in the UK is very conservative. It's bound by disciplines, professional boundary keeping, keeps every subject separated and hinders cross-course collaboration. Multidisciplinary practice is something to aspire to as an architect in 2021, yet it is impossible at most universities. You choose your degree and then you're kept with your own kind, often in your own building, and architects don't even use the communal spaces at universities. They have their own special studio because they're extra special. And if this wasn't restricting our shared learning enough, architecture schools love to separate their students out year by year and have us all working on our own, very precious individual projects. We also reflected a little bit on the power structure between academics and practitioners. Obviously, we've sort of touched on this a little bit already tonight, but I think in SWA, although this often comes with some compromise, the general consensus was that best tutors were the tutors that were practitioners as well. Practitioners tutoring at university is not only widely accepted, it's encouraged, and in a way is essential in going some way to bridge the gap between education and practice. But why is this a one-way street? Academics rarely come back into practice. For example, we've never had a lecturer come into the office to teach us how to think better. Arguably, client, fee, and time management are the three key aspects of successful business, and these were missing from pretty much all of our different educational experiences. Longer hours does not mean harder worker or better worker. Working late starts during education, as has been alluded to, and is ingrained in university and practice culture, as highlighted by FAF earlier this year with the RIBA open letter. This also exacerbates the inaccessibility of architecture. If you're studying all the time, you have no time for a part-time job, which you might need to support you, on a course which is already very unaffordable. And clearly no one feels that they're getting value for money on. In terms of client relationships, could tutors push their role further into that of the client, helping students to refine their skill set to include negotiation, emotional intelligence, and leadership? There seems to be this strange fear that introducing reality at university might mean that you lose the design vision. But I think all of us at SWA strongly disagree with that and think that reality helps you to refine your knowledge and the standing behind your design ideas. Finally, we reflected on what we were taught at university and our experience in practice and how those two things might have differed. These are some of the things that we champion at SWA and feel are critical to the future of our industry. and actually the world, if we want to go there. But these are things that were barely touched upon during our experience in education. Of course, it works both ways, but maybe if these were the focus of architectural education more often, we would see a positive knock-on effect in wider architectural practice. And that's me. Oh, how do I stop sharing? Oh, thanks awesome, everyone. Hope you enjoyed the lowbrow memes.
Very highbrow, very high key.
It's not lowbrow.
Very highbrow.
It's a very intelligent way of condensing a point. And
I tried to go, you know, wide ranging. So hopefully there was one on there that, you know, people could relate to. I mean, who hasn't seen Harry Potter? But...
Yeah, don't get us started on memes as contemporary criticism. We'll be here all night.
Quick, let's move on.
Sure. That was fantastic. Thank you, Claire. That was. I feel like you covered so many points. We could go anywhere. But Dana, I think you are up next. If you're ready to go.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me be part of this. I'm going to share my screen now. And hopefully you can all see the slides. Great stuff. So I'm Dana Walker. I'm actually a social entrepreneur now. I run an organisation called Built by Us, and we're very much focused on the idea of increasing diversity, inclusion, and equity in the built environment. There seems to be a slight technical issue at my end in terms of sharing slides. I'm going to stop for a second, and I'm going to turn off my camera. Hopefully I can still share. If I do that, try again. Apologies for this. Did you see any slides at all?
Yeah, when it was on the non-full screen and you could see a bit of the window around it, it was perfect. Maybe okay. We could just let's like scroll through it in the window maybe.
Okay, right. Let's give this another go. I'm so sorry about this, everybody.
No problem. I feel like this is an everyday occurrence.
Yeah.
You're either muted or you can't see the screen being shared.
Yeah,
it's part of internet culture.
Yeah.
I'm
waiting for a cat or a dog to come into somebody's screen.
Here you go.
Next one.
Do you see a dog?
There's a dog.
Your wish is my command. So I'm going to try going full screen again. There we go. There we go. Apologies for that delay. So I'm sharing with you a kind of personal perspective, which very much reflects my career and also the inspiration for setting up Built by Us in the first place. So one of the questions I was reflecting on in terms of this sort of friend or foe was architectural education as I experienced it. So my background, I'm not sort of typical in terms of my architectural journey. I actually started life in construction as an electrician. So I did a 4-year apprenticeship back in the day, a mixture between going to college and doing work on site. It was a dream of mine, first person in my family to go to university. And I didn't know very much about architecture, and coming from I guess, working class and low income family, I didn't really have anybody who was, in my circle that could kind of share a view. I very much kind of jumped in at the deep end. And this particular image of the rather surprised dog is very much how I felt through much of my architecture education. It was such a shock to me that it was so different from being an electrician. Being an electrician, being an apprentice, you were constantly It was all about learning how to do the role. So it was so intriguing to me that I got into architecture, and actually learning about how to do the role wasn't necessarily the kind of core of it. There was a huge amount of exploration. I enjoyed my time in architectural education. However, it was a shock going from part one into practice in terms of the very different expectations and the kind of technical understanding that was expected. I can remember asking the question of my tutors at the time about that technical understanding, that kind of pragmatism. And I was told by my tutors that I would learn how to build while I was in practice. So you may be asking yourself, what does this have to do with diversity? Well, for me, I think it made the whole journey so much harder. Coming to this as an outsider without that kind of social capital and experience, and then being part of a course, and of course all courses are different, which didn't necessarily get to the nitty-gritty of what you needed to do, was painful. There were already issues in terms of how I would be seen. I knew that I was a minority in so many ways for the profession as a woman of colour, and also coming from a lower income family. So going into practice with that sort of feeling and concern about how I would be treated, and then feeling I didn't have all of the tools to do the role, was very, very difficult. And I think it can be very difficult for people from much more diverse backgrounds. How I wanted to feel was something more like this: fearless. I think architecture education does need to shift in terms of living up to the expectations of the students who are spending huge amounts of money and time investing in their education to go on to perhaps be architects, perhaps be other things, perhaps aligned to the profession or even outside. But I think there's something really important that doesn't necessarily get picked up in the process, and some of those have already been highlighted this evening. But I particularly like to focus on the sort of collaborative, technical and pragmatic aspects. Creativity is there, but it's not necessarily creativity around the business, management and leadership aspects of architecture, which are so important. Education more like practice, practice more like education. I'm not sure if this is the right question. It's definitely something that both places can learn, but I think we need to address the dysfunction in each and the way that each of these places inform the dysfunction of the other. So we talked about the sort of long hours and huge amounts of work for students, and that seems to transfer sometimes, often, into the experience of people within practice. So we need to address that. We also need to address the sort of business model, if you like, for both of those spaces. So ways forward. We need to think about the business models for practice and for university, as we see so many changes in the way that university is funded. We really need to think about equity much more seriously, about how we meet students where they are and support them in moving forward. And I think we need to move the conversation on from education versus practice, which can lead to a certain amount of shoegazing, and look outside to reflect on how other professionals do it. Architects are not the only professions out there, but we're constantly talking about how as professionals we are considered less than we used to be, that the mode of work that we're doing and how we're being paid is changing. But I think we actually need to look to others and learn from other sectors about how we can do it better for practice and for education. Thank you.
We definitely need to lobby the Zoom engineers to find an applause button.
Thank you.
Yeah,
that was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, or have like a soundboard or something.
Yeah, for sure, and a dog request button. That was great. Thank you. And I think the more that we're talking about this, I think everybody on the panel's sort of individual stories is sort of coming out more to light, and I'd love to sort of talk about that sort of when we get into the Q&A. about, we've sort of discussed with FAF and on Instagram about non-linear routes into the profession. Are there other alternatives to sort of be a better built environment person? And I think you sort of touched on those elements, and how can we allow that as a sort of ecosystem to, provide equity, right, across the sort of paradigm, rather than, we often talk, Priti and Charlie and I, about this idea that modernism, was in the 1920s, and we're still sort of feeling like it's the lone architect, the Corbusian man who sort of drives the modular and it's the machine for living. But we're in 2021.
Yeah, wears the glasses, stands contemplatively in the middle of an empty room.
For sure. Anyway, let's get on to the next presentation. Zafir, you are up, if you are ready to go.
Cool. Let's just share screen and hope and pray that it works. Can you all see this? Great.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yep.
So I'm Zafir Amin. I'm an architectural assistant, but I guess today I'll be more speaking from the background of ACAN, in particular ACAN Education and the Student Climate Action Network. So I thought maybe I'll go with a really quick background into who maybe ACAN is for people who maybe aren't quite aware. So ACAN, which is the Architects Climate Action Network, is a volunteer organization about climate activism, trying to address the twin climate and ecological crises. And this is kind of a really rough diagram kind of showing how it's organized, because there are several hundred members all doing very exciting things. We're kind of non-hierarchical, but organized in groups to tackle different elements such as circular economy, embodied carbon, and of course education, which is where I'll primarily be speaking from. And then the Students Climate Action Network, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but it's kind of like a link to the ACAN network, and kind of lobbying for change from a grassroots activism, as well as tackling it from a top-down approach, which is what ACAN Education does as well. So I guess as an organization for StuCan, these are kind of the things that we wanted to see and bring about change. So I guess if you haven't already guessed, a lot of this is about climate activism. So we wanted to kind of increase student agency and making sure that we involve students and unite the voices that we do have across the UK and beyond, and kind of support a cultural transformation. This is one of the aims of ACAN in general, but something that we also wanted to kind of bring across into StuCan as well. And I guess in terms of how it's going, to give a kind of scale of where where we're up to at the moment, these are the kind of student groups that we've helped set up all over the UK. So there's about 25 now, which is pretty incredible, that we've managed to reach this amount of people. I guess that's maybe one of the advantages of lockdown and digital working, is that we were able to go and support and see lots of these pop up. But it's also good that we're getting lots of interest from the EU and international as well. So hopefully we can kind of work on uniting a global voice against climate change, and also ensuring getting student perspective as well. And I guess that was kind of like the who we are. And in terms of like the why, I guess we were asked to create a meme of what we think architectural education is, but I think this is maybe a pan-industry problem, and I think lots of you will maybe associate and relate to this issue of the answer being maybe right in front of us, and having a building that we could easily retrofit, that we could easily make changes to, easily source better materials, but instead we just demolish for something that's supposedly way more sustainable. So this started off as a meme against architectural education and became more of just a pan-industry critique, but oh well. And I guess also from a student perspective, the same kind of feelings were also resonated there. So just like FAF, we also love a good survey. So we did a climate curriculum survey a year ago. Actually, I say we, I wasn't even in ACAD at this point, but ACAD did a survey asking how students felt and if they felt they were being properly prepared in terms of the climate emergency. And as you can see, 77% did not feel that they were being equipped. And this was from 101 respondents. And I guess a more recent kind of visual to kind of support this. So this is that our launch event for the StuCan that we had. Now we actually had this with FAF, who kindly spoke. And we're just kind of going through what students felt or were going through. So the question was, how did they give like a few words that summarizes their personal emotional response to the climate emergency? And I think it's quite interesting that it's actually getting a mix of emotions now, ranging right the way from, I guess, despair and frustration all the way to hope, which is really like nice to see that becoming more of more of a trend. And in terms of what we think it should be, so I think you'll excuse this maybe more nerdy memes that these become, we decided to kind of embody, I guess, the ACAN aims. So these are things that ACAN in general operates on, which is ecological regeneration, cultural transformation, and to decarbonize now. And I guess I expanded on it a bit to also include decolonize now, which I think is maybe something that we should also, be heavily focusing on, and something that I think, I think education would, especially architectural education, would benefit from having not just one, but I guess in the words of Pokemon, catching them all and having everything. And I guess this also is maybe a cheat of the question of trying to figure out architecture education versus practice. And I guess I kind of went for a similar route to what other speakers have gone through, which is kind of a synergy between them. And I guess it's kind of, the circular problem of having UU projects which are really progressive and explore various interesting topics, maybe lack the realism that practice has, and then sometimes gets critiqued for lacking that. And then the profession in general traditionally only awards and rewards aesthetics. So we're in this constant circle of that. And meanwhile, there's the climate ecological emergency just creeping up behind us without many people even realizing. And I guess more personally, I would agree that I think there needs to be a change in terms of alternative models. And like, I'm quite a big supporter of models like the Sheffield Collaborative or the LSA or even the apprenticeship, where you get a bit of both and you get to experience both simultaneously. But that's more a, I guess, a personal view than an ACAN or STUCAN view. And in terms of, I guess, what could happen, I think nothing is really more important than collaboration. So again, another really nerdy beat. I guess you kind of see what kind of person I am, but oh well. And I think that while lobbying for change is vital, I think, it has to happen through collective action. So these are some incredible organizations that if you don't know them, I would definitely recommend looking at them. And it's by no means exhaustive or in order, apart from the ARB and RIBA being last. Everybody else is pretty much in order. So yes, I think in terms of climate activism, I guess it's something that we're trying to do a lot more, is collaborate. And between like Letty, ACAN, and Architects Declare, which are three of the climate, I guess, architecture organizations that you may have heard of, we're trying to ensure that this happens a lot more. And I guess in the run up to COP26, this is something especially that we're working towards as like a date, and trying to get our campaigns better aligned and supporting each other. And because I think collective action truly is the solution. And I guess one final point in terms of maybe like next actions or what you can do, I think it's just lobbying for what you believe in. And I guess that's, the real reason that I joined ACAN, and why lots of people join STUCAN, is to kind of get their voices heard. And there's so many great organizations and ways that you can help. And I think you should definitely become involved. And I guess I just want to leave you on like one last quote from Scott McCauley, who's a really active member of ACAN and the founder of the Anthropocene Architecture School, who always says that students have more agency than they're told. I think that's quite a poignant thing to remember, that you have lots of agency and responsibility, and you can do a lot. So I think that is everything. Thank you so much.
Wow, presentations keep getting stronger and stronger. Where's the dog button?
That's very offensive to the person who gave the first presentation, Rachel.
Yeah, awkward.
It's okay, because we'll circle back and then you can sort of
improve.
That was great. I love that quote. Students have more agency than they're told to have. I feel like that's a sort of recurring theme in a lot of these discussions we have, and sort of Q&A and invitations to speak, especially with what's happening with the sort of Bartlett School allegations. It's like, when can people sort of have a voice and have agency, and where can you sort of align, daily actions to sort of, create this Marvels Assemble sort of cinematography moment, which actually I was surprised you even included the ARB and RIBA. Right? I feel like they were the sort of off-screen characters that were sort of mentioned in passing at the end of the movie, perhaps. But I'm being harsh, I apologize. You also mentioned the LSA, so maybe it'd be great, Ming, I know that you do some work there at the LSA, so I'm sure there'll be some link there on overlapping topics. But yeah, really, I think poignant. And I think we got to talk to you about how to set up multiple places across the country like you have with STUCAN. I think that's really, really impressive, for sure. But yeah, students have more agency than they're told to have. So do use the Q&A section and the social media functions to get your voice heard, and we'll cover those questions later. We're already getting some great sort of thematic questions, great personal questions as well, that I think will be great to cover. So next we have Samita.
Hi there. Thanks very much, Rachel. So I'm a chartered architect and trustee and author. I set up Architects for Change, which is the RIBA's Equality Forum 21 years ago, and things haven't changed that much. That's something I'm laughing about, but I shouldn't laugh about it. So I've been teaching architecture for decades, including the RIBA Part 3. And for those who have made it this far into the 8 or 9 years that takes into becoming an architect, registration could be a moment of great celebration. However, work periods during the course have provided loopholes for those who wish to exploit the so-called cheap labor of students. Low or even no pay, 0 hours contracts, long hours culture, poor employment practices have become very common. You already heard Preeti talk about this. Throw into this gender, class, ethnicity, disability, and overseas students, you get to even more insidious practices. I find that most exploited students belong to one or more of these groups. The rate of attrition for both women and minority ethnic students may be a reflection of this. Over the years, I've heard specific examples of poor work practices, such as students working late, getting a meal or a taxi home only if they've worked until 8 or 11 p.m., such as students working late into the night, then returning early morning to finish the work. And I mean something like 7 o'clock in the morning, such as working weekends without pay with the promise of time backs. I'd never heard of this phrase before, time backs. And that too only after completing a minimum of overtime, such as being sacked or treated badly if they complain or they refuse to opt out of working more than 48 hours a week, and being asked to work while on furlough, such as not being given time off for exam revision. Students have told me that they were asked to carry out menial tasks at work from which they learned little, but also shockingly things such as washing up and cleaning the office. As a member of the RIBA's Professional Standards Panel and Ethics Commission, I know that all of these don't comply with the RIBA and ARB codes of conduct. And it's funny because just yesterday I finished working on a case which actually was about student work. It was the first time in several years that I've come across this one. Some have argued that since architects themselves are paid poorly and since they work long hours, this then continues down to the food chain affecting students. But is that beneficial to the profession as such? That's what I want to ask you today. Shouldn't asking for better fees be for everyone's collective gain, whether that's economic, employment, or health? I've also heard the argument that long hours culture is ingrained through academia, where all-nighters are encouraged. Again, I'd like to argue that whether it's academia or practice, time management should become an essential skill set. I think Claire was talking about that earlier on. If practitioners cannot manage time, which is the most important resource they have, they can't be called professional. As a trustee of the Architects Benevolent Society, which helps architects and students, I was dismayed to find out that last year, 45% of the help requested was for mental health issues. Poor work conditions, increased stress, staff turnover, and also in staff not being able to complete their work effectively or not at all. Frequent recruitment is expensive and time consuming, especially for small practices, which constitute about 80% of the RIBA's practice. Apart from economic reasons, there is a moral imperative for looking after our staff members, whatever their status. Looking after our future colleagues will enable our profession to become diverse and sustainable. I would like architects to look to good employment practices in other professions and careers and even countries. There are many big or small architecture firms that have had good work practices. These ought to be celebrated. Since 2001, I've argued for an award for RIBA Best Employer along awards for design and teaching. This makes sense in a profession where practice and education are so intertwined. Could the COVID pandemic has introduced flexible and hybrid working practices. architects had to adapt to these very quickly. And I know that many people, including carers, have benefited from this. I look forward to other ways where education and practice can work together to develop a profession where our future colleagues and our future profession become truly creative, motivated, and meaningful. So in short, can architectural education support a diverse group of people to practice architecture in a way they love? Yes, is my answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow. There was a lot to cover there, and I feel like that was also a great sort of summary of, I think, all of the data that we as a sort of panel group have been working with sort of colloquially anyway. So it's great to sort of hear that from your voice and hear your perspective. And, you know, I think everybody here respects, you know, not to be unkind, but the sort of the wisdom that you have of sort of fighting this fight as long as you have. I mean, I was doing some research and I saw that, you know, when you're talking about Architects for Change that you made 21 years ago, which, I mean, that's crazy. I mean, we only talk about Architects for Change, you know, only 20 years ago. But a sort of, and you've written papers on diversity and inclusion since, you know, 2008. I know, Claire, you've referenced that in some diversity reports for SWA. And in fact, Dana, you also have had representation in Architects for Change. And I guess, you know, a lot of people in the attendees will probably wonder, you know, all of these great ideas, all of these great sort of heroes, you know, why hasn't anything happened? Why are we still talking about, you know, the same issues? You know, I think those are really poignant concerns that people will have. But it's great to have you on so that we can address them in the Q&A. All right. Up next, we have Jasmine and Punya on representing Freehouse. Am I correct in thinking that it's a joint presentation and not?
Indeed, you are correct.
Okay, great.
Great, I'll just share.
Nice one.
Let me put this on full screen and hope that it works. Okay.
Just give that a second.
How's that working? Yes or no?
It just brought up some kind of black squares on the side of the screen for me.
Try one more time.
Oh yeah, perfect. There we go. Okay, nice one. So yeah, as Roshan's already said, I'm Jasmine.
And I'm Punya, and we're part of the team at Freehouse.
I'm a recent graduate and I maintain active ties to my university.
And I'm a chartered architect and an educator.
At Freehouse, we're advocates of marrying work and practice with socially orientated outputs that benefit the communities we serve. Freehouse has always maintained an active role in the academic sphere, and we believe that part of our role as practitioners is to nurture others along their pathway, and so these are just some of our involvements. And so you've asked us to consider our experience of architecture education, and to understand this, you need to understand the context in which we were educated.
The current system is predicated on a strong, stable economy, but we all know from painful experience this has been far from our reality, which Jasmine and I have been exploring through conversation. And this is a product of our exchanges. So in considering the questions FAF had posed, we found ourselves asking more. To begin with, what is architectural education? At present, it's a linear progression made up of 5 unsatisfactorily discrete elements. Education and practice seem rather wary of themselves until you get to part 3. Sadly, the challenging economic context we've been operating in has seen an increasing number of students unable to get on the first rung of the professional ladder. This is compounding inequalities in progression, putting students' ability to cope with the part 2 curriculum at risk, even if universities are willing to accept them without practice experience.
And so to address this, should practice be more like education or education be more like practice? And well, we both agreed neither. Why would you put 2 completely different jigsaw puzzles together in the hope that they create a coherent picture? Or as the artist Tim Klein has called it, an iron horse. And so the motivations which drive the content and structure of architectural education at present are not clear to students either, particularly at undergrad level, causing our journey into the world of architecture to be one of complete disorientation.
And so we found ourselves delving further. What is education?
As a recent graduate, my experience is that education and learning aren't mutually inclusive. As I see it, learning is an experiential process of acquiring knowledge, whereas education is the rigid system whereby knowledge is imparted through imitation via a prescriptive set of rules.
As an educator, I see education as the opportunity to acquire discipline-specific skills, and what those are should be part of this discussion, to cultivate intellectual and creative rigor and freedom within the relative safety of the academic space, and crucially, the development of critical thought. All of which are being challenged by the ever-emerging reality of the university as corporate entity.
And so who does the status quo benefit? We're currently seeing an outpouring of dissatisfaction and distress from graduates and early practitioners. The SWA call to action, an open letter which I helped to co-write last summer, was a manifestation of this. It argues that our university has been and remains complicit in the structures that maintain white hegemony and continue to contribute to ongoing class division. As a collective, we recognise that our experiences were inequitable and that we were stuck within a landscape of inaction.
Alongside this, the FAF open letter testimonials revealed a palpable sense of shock felt by the practitioners as they enter practice, as well as the stark realisation of how little agency they possess to change the system. The RIBA's response in its RIBA Compact is welcome, but doesn't go as far as addressing the first steps in a student's pathway into practice, and instead focuses on necessary ethical practice standards to support graduates once they actually have a job. So what now? Well, who, along with the RIBA, are the code producers of this architectural education that we know? The ARB, practice, universities, tutors, and governments?
But who should they be? We need to establish a meaningful way of allowing students to be co-producers of their own education. But how can they be if they have no real sense of where they're heading towards? Education and practice shouldn't be fearful of each other, and education without context is problematic at best, especially to those most vulnerable, undergraduates.
Instead, the landscape of architectural education should look more like this. We already know that universities have no money and practices have no capacity. Amongst other potential measures, why not give students the opportunity to learn through observation in a practice context by integrating regular work shadowing opportunities into the undergrad degree, with no obligation for practices to train students or right to make them work, which we would argue better addresses the core attributes set by the ARB for a Part 1 to be able to graduate.
And finally, the way ahead as we see it heralds the end of the harmful perpetuation of the fiction of architect as messiah, and instead the rise of the architect as co-producer of the built environment. So we propose, in addition to the 2020 RIBA education themes and values, embedding collaborative working practices firmly into the architectural education by 2022. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, great. Anybody from RIBA on the line to accept these proposals? That was amazing. Yeah. Let's. We should have got the live stream just for that. Yeah,
hopefully
amazing.
they'll watch it back. Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yes, just direct DMs and emails into.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it'll be. Yeah.
I'll email Alan the video.
Yeah, and I think also amazing to have sort of specific calls to action and sort of specific plan and how they could integrate with current structures that we have. I think that's a really encouraging sort of thing for everybody to just look at and talk about. It's amazing, really. Last but not least, Ming, you're up next.
Right.
If
okay.
You're ready to go.
Yep. I'll try to. I'll try my best to to best the last presentation. So here we go. Right. Can somebody just say that they can actually see? They can actually see the screen.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah,
that's great. Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much. For the invitation. Great presentation so far. So I'll see. I'll just part with some of my thoughts. So just a bit of quick introduction. My name is Ming Chang. I'm actually a qualified architect, but also a qualified planner and urban designer. Been practicing, for about 20 years. I have my own practice. I also teach at the London School of Architecture and also the MSc Urban Design at the Barlock School of Planning, and then also architecture at University of Suffolk. So that's me. I mean, you know, when you just sent to me, you know, what we're supposed to, you know, what is actually my understanding of architectural education is, you know, I think we got to address, you know, almost kind of like the elephant in the room is, before we even actually get into architecture, you know, the suppose, you know, the image actually being beamed upon us, you know, from ranging from the architecture open day, you know, when you're in the sixth form, you go to all these open day, or the end of year exhibition with all the glitzy and amazing, you know, exhibitions, you know, and all that, down to the media, you know, that's what you're being portrayed, you know, what architecture is supposed to be. I mean, this is actually the film, you know, like Lake House, you know, with Keanu Reeves, you know, as an architect, you know, we almost have this kind of rose tinted glasses, you know, image, you know, already. Whereas in terms of my education, you know, is actually very different. You know, I study architecture very late, you know, I studied planning first and then later retrain, you know, myself as an architect. When I actually have a family, you know, with kids, I actually study part-time. So I actually will be working 4 days a week and then 1 day release. So it's actually a very, very different kind of game, you know, in terms of how my experience is. So constantly have to worry about work, you know, about my family, you know, being as a parent, and then thinking about deadlines, you know, in terms of work deadline and on family and deadline and work deadline. And that's before even, you know, I start worrying about what my career prospect is going to be. And last but not least is actually kind of my mental health. So it's like a very, very different thing. And what I think we need to address that. And then you sort of think, well, what architecture should be, and I think we need to almost sort of think about, you know, what architecture education shouldn't be, is that, you know, throughout the education, you know, we're constantly being beamed, you know, with this idea of what is great architects, yeah, actually have with all these amazing buildings, and then they build this kind of empire of architectural practices, you know, they're going to be, you know, calling all the shots. And you end up, you know, we're just building this kind of expectation, and then we don't actually meet it, and then you just sort of think, you know, you're completely very, very disappointed. And I think you know, what architecture education should be, you know, is about a self-discovery journey, you know, about who you are and what you actually want to do, and it's a challenge, you know, about what you want to get out of it, what you want to build something out of that, you know, as a result, you know, of the course. And it's a constant reminder, you know, of my teaching at the LSA, you know, is about, you know, what sort of architects do you want to be? And quite often, you know, from what I know, is some of the students from the LSA, they actually end up not being an architect, you know, you know, when they graduated or further on in their career. And that's okay. And I think we need to, you know, we should actually teach about that you don't have to be, you know, this kind of fixed idea about what you should be, you know, as a result, you know, of having the architecture education. And quite often, you know, we actually ask, you know, what should sort of practice be more like education, or actually the other way around? And, you know, some of the online or social media, you know, the nuance is actually put it back onto architecture school, you know, to say, well, you know, architecture school has to be reformed, and I understand that, and I completely agree, you know, from things like, you know, things that are actually not actually addressing, you know, things like business development, marketing, you know, fee proposals, how to pitch for work, you know, client and planning law. But then at the same time, you know, from time to time again, I also actually have this actually saying, well, architecture school you should just teach students how to use Revit, because that's actually what the industry actually asks for. But I don't think it should be about that. You know, architecture education should be about you being a critical thinker. You should be asking the right questions, you know, when you get out of architecture education, instead of being this kind of technological technician. You know, that's not what learning in architecture education is about. And then I do actually just wonder, you know, are we actually asking all the wrong questions, you know, in this instance? And just going forward, you know, in terms of, you know, suggesting maybe something that we can go forward. I mean, I almost always wonder whether we could actually learn from, let's say, some of the business school, you know, courses from business school. From what I know is, you know, they actually will will collaborate, with other courses, from different people, so from business, from also through finances, and they work together with these almost kind of like a workshop, 3 days workshop, whereas they all have to work together, come up with a business plan, and they actually have real company who will come in when they pitch this idea to these company, and whoever actually got top marks or whatever, the company will invest in that idea because that is a great idea, and then the student will actually becomes almost get some real life experience and also something that will happen. And I just wonder, why can't we actually have that? Why can't we actually have architects, landscape architect, planning, engineering, and actually pitch to developers and then planners and QS, and all that, and actually make a building, out of that, at the end, and some sort of architecture's dragons in, I mean, that's my thinking, behind it. So thank you so much, for your time.
Thanks, Ming. Yeah, lots of points, and I love sort of the language that you're using, sort of architect's dragon den, empire of architectural practices, that sort of sets the scene in the sort of context that you're discussing. And I think what's interesting, particularly people who are have a step in education, I think there's a wider discourse, isn't there, about is architectural education a sort of what you might consider a sort of polytechnic sort of approach to learning, where you're being taught how to drive the car, or is it sort of thinking, how do I become Sebastian Vettel, sort of free thinker, rule breaker sort of guy, within the context though of what's already been discussed already about the sort of business environment that we live in, is that if everybody is a free thinker, then nobody is actually drawing, and then is there a sort of trickle down effect on students who have to then pick up sort of that labor that's been discussed. I think yeah, loads of great big questions, who is the architect, who should be the architect, rather than perhaps practice versus education. Yeah, deep thoughts, very exciting.
Cool. Speaking of big questions, Roshan, how's our Q&A section looking?
Q&A, we've got a couple of good questions. Shall we start with the most upvoted question so far, which also happens to be the first question, by an anonymous attendee. If you could go back in time and give your teenage self a piece of advice before you set out on your architecture journey, what would it be? Let's let that sit. Go ahead, Pretty, you're going.
There's no hand function. Mine would be that you are intelligent and your rebellion against the curriculum is true, it's real, and it's not something that you're making up in your head. I felt like in architectural education, where I went to school, it was all Palladio, Venice, Rome. The lecturers would talk as if you've obviously been to Venice. Like, I'm Indian, I'm working class. Why would my mum take me to Rome? I went to Tanzania every year. And so, the fact that my cultural experience and my cultural capital didn't align with the architectural education did not make me any less of an architect. And utilizing that power and utilizing your differences where you feel the frictions in the curriculum is what's going to make you stand out, and it's what's going to make sure that the work that you do has impact. So ride with it, question it, and rebel.
Where can we get that on a t-shirt? Ride with it. What was it? Ride with it, rebel. There was 3 lines there. What was it? Is it lost in the moment?
That's one of those ones where you're channeling some kind of like higher energy, and then after you've said it, you're like, what did I just say? Like, it was good, but it's out into the world now.
I mean, FAF essentially started out in the pub. It was me and Charlie ranting in the pub, and this is what would come out.
Yeah, it was a miracle we ever remembered anything to like write it down, to be honest.
But I guess as well that a part of this question is sort of saying, what if you're, 16, 17, 18, you're sitting your A levels, and, you have your career counselor, if you're able to have one, and you're sort of measuring up, where are the jobs that I can be, lawyer, doctor, engineer, architect, what would you say to those teenagers? And I think Dana and Ming, I think because you guys had a particularly sort of different path, it'd be great to hear sort of your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Oh.
No, Dana, you go first.
Yeah, thank you. Building on what Priti was saying about that kind of valuing yourself, your experience and your thoughts, I think, that's incredibly important. I'm so pleased in a way that I did something else before I did architecture, because I think it's such a peculiar and unique culture that you enter into. And I'm not sure that I would have questioned it as much if I hadn't have done something else first. I found it incredibly odd, and in some ways still do. But that's partly because I was always kind of measuring it against, my personal experiences, as well as already having experienced a different education system. So gosh, 16. Well, I started as a mature student, so I'm going to go 21, 22, but partly keep going and you're not crazy. I think it's the thing that I want to say to myself, is that because a lot of the time I was just like, why does no one else see this? Why does no one else think this is odd? I think one of the issues for architecture is because it's been a monoculture to a certain extent for so long, you don't have the people asking the very best question, which is why? Why is it like this? We haven't had that disruption that many other sectors have had, which have forced us to kind of look at what we do, how we do it, and why we do it.
I completely, agree with that. I think, for myself, even for my younger self. I mean, as I said before, I study architecture late. I think even I knew what I actually get myself into. I think one of the things that I didn't actually know until almost kind of 4th or 5th year is the whole idea of crits. When you go out for the crits, when they actually say something to you, is that I have to learn that is nothing personal. They just want to ask you some very critical question, and you have the right to, what you have to learn is you have to process it and just say, yep, I agree with this, and I don't agree with some of these, and that's okay. And nobody actually taught me that until almost kind of I realized in my 4th or 5th year to say, well, that's fine. I understand your point of view, but you're external critic. You don't understand, my project. You have way more experience than I am, but this is my idea. This kind of critical thinking, which I think is really important. But then it just hasn't been explicitly kind of taught in architecture education, is that this is actually your own mind, and you should be the critical thinker to reject the criticism. I think that's what I would tell myself.
Good words. But the t-shirt sales from these words of wisdom are going to be absolutely stellar, guys. I think we should, this is the next business venture. Oh, this is the Architects Dragon's Den that we got to do. Claire, I mean, just quickly, because I know that SWA, you guys have sort of engagement workshops with younger people in their teenagehood, and you sort of mentioned, how do you access people even before university? What are the experiences you're finding there about sort of guiding young people, with wide eyes open, but equally with a sense of wonder that we all sort of, I think, share about the built environment? And I think there's some sort of wider questions here sort of related to that. So that would be great to just, if you can speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think one of the first things to say is that it is, you do feel like you're in a bit of a tricky situation, because obviously you want to encourage the most diverse group of people to come into our profession, but you also feel a bit guilty because you're encouraging them into a profession which is incredibly flawed, and needs to be worked on simultaneously. So I do think that we're, the conversation about, obviously we've been focusing on education, but the conversations about practice as well, that has to happen simultaneously. I think one of the main things really in my experience talking to young people is, you know, that idea that you don't have to have studied art. It sounds so simple now, but I do think that still within traditional schooling systems, you know, architecture is not touched upon within core subjects. You know, I only knew about it because I had an interest in art. I didn't really want to go to university, but because of the art element, architecture was kind of encouraged. So I do think that kind of, trying to increase references to architecture, the built environment in other subjects is a really good place to start. I mean, we are lucky that we work on quite a lot of education projects within the practice, so that provides an incredible platform for us to engage directly with young people. You know, at the moment we're doing engagement with primary school age groups, and you know that sort of spans from design-based workshops, but it also introduces ideas about sustainability, reuse. You know, we're retrofitting their schools, so there's also talk about, you know, the sort of environmental performance of their building, and it's kind of introducing these ideas early on and actually trying to use construction work in a school, which is often seen as a real sort of frustration for students, staff, parents, as a real learning opportunity, and sort of getting the students in their PPE and getting them onto the site and talking to the contractors. And, you know, it's little things like that, but you know, we're sort of exploring as a way to sort of, encourage more young people into the profession, whilst also, trying to improve the industry simultaneously. It's just a small job, you know.
Whatever, just changing the world, one child at a time.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I mean, the way that you talk about it, I feel, you know, the same principles really could easily be applied into normal architectural education. I mean, if you took a bunch of undergrads, you know, who really, they're babies, they don't know anything, and you said, put on some PPE, let's talk to a contractor, go play Bob the Builder for a little bit, and let's come back and talk about the ideas generated. I mean, that in itself as one exercise could perhaps be way more informative than, you know, overworking, you know, culture that we've seen in, you know, week one undergrad students. Yeah, amazing. I think that's amazing work that you're doing, and you might as well call yourself a pediatrician. That's the doctors who save kids, right?
Not sure I go that far, but I appreciate the sentiment.
Yeah, I mean, in comparison to Ming's reference to empires of practice, you know, helping kids understand buildings, I mean, that's pretty noble work. We need to put that in Zafir's Marvel's Assemble sort of picture. All right, we have loads of questions, so I'm just trying to skim here on the sort of top questions. So here's one for FAF, and it's sort of related to later in life. It's got 3 upvotes from Claire Richards. I studied architecture in midlife, naively expecting I would learn about the profession's social context and purpose. I've been pushing for change ever since through my practice work. I strongly believe student power is the way forward. Has FAF's research and campaigning covered this aspect? Really impressed by what you're doing. Pretty or Charlie, do you want to?
I can start on that one. Yeah, I think in terms of the, I think it's a bit like what we were talking about earlier in terms of the agency and the power that students don't realize they have in a lot of ways. And we haven't sort of covered it in the sense of it being like the formal focus of any of the work we've done, but it's always been, you know, the sort of tangential companion to everything that we've done, because at the end of the day, we are just a group of young people who started, you know, making a lot of noise and getting on some people's nerves. So I think the sort of the idea of the power of like young people to organize and sort of take the limited power that we have individually and combine that into grassroots organizations, that is sort of the undercurrent of everything that we do. And I think my favorite thing about you know, this kind of journey of, you know, organizing and running FAF has been seeing not only, you know, our group sort of form and find its own identity, but to see how we've been able to interact with other similar initiatives, like we, you know, how we sit alongside like ACAN, like UVW SAW, the STUCAN, the new one, things like there's so many now, like there's so many small initiatives and they each have their own, you know, niche where they really excel in, and they can really talk authoritatively on a certain topic. And yeah, this sort of like interesting little student, you know, junior practitioner grassroots network that's sort of sprung up over only the last few years, really. I think it's really fascinating. And I'm really, really interested to see where it goes, considering we are still in the very early years of seeing all of these groups emerge. So yeah, it's something that's still in its early days, but I'm very optimistic about it.
And also just to add to that, I think that our role has become one that is to activate student power. I think a lot of us, especially in our early education architecture, believe architecture to kind of be apolitical, especially in terms of our role as students within this institution and system.
Yeah.
However, political power can be unlocked. You don't necessarily need to be that person screaming at the front with a billboard, but small actions activated through campaigns like FAF, through collaborations with other groups, can really create huge change, as we've seen with the open letter. So I think our role is to activate political power amongst young people. Yeah,
that's a much more well put way of, yeah, far more concise than myself. So this is why we work well together.
Great. Claire, I hope that answered your question. Yeah, things are looking bright. Our next voted question is from a anonymous attendee. How do you find time to cover all the equally important topics within an existing architectural course? Do you start to offer more specialized degrees in architecture, or do you see this as something that can be integrated within the existing system? I think this is a great question for Jasmine and Punya. You guys had a sort of plan on how education might be restructured, and then maybe we can move on to maybe Ming or Dana or Smita perhaps, and just open it up to the floor.
Thank you. Yes, Jasmine, yeah, join it. I'm not.
Yeah, Punya, do you want to start?
Taking ownership.
No.
I'll start. Yeah.
No pressure with this question.
So I think just thinking about, I mean, obviously there are constraints that we're dealing with in terms of, I mean, everyone's aware of how squeezed finance is in universities and the kind of pressure they're under. And I mean, I think this is a question which I'm asking myself. I mean, I'm a tutor, I'm a year one studio tutor, and also teach advocacy, which is in year 4, which is kind of asking architects to question their role in practice. But I think as a practitioner myself, I'm at the level where I don't really know how the budgets get divvied up. I don't have that agency myself in terms of sort of putting pressure on institutions to do one thing or another. But I think my instinct with this question is perhaps that if you begin to specialize in sort of peeling off some of these things away from the central curriculum, they'll start to be looked at as optional. And from my point of view, all the issues that we're talking about now, none of these are optional in terms of dealing with the built environment and producing practitioners that can deal with the challenges of the future and the challenges of today. So I think there's more work to be done between all the organisations that are producing the architectural education at the moment. And crucially, as we were talking about in our presentation, that students or some kind of representative from students, they should be part of those discussions. I mean, almost leading on to the next question I can see in the chat is about the way ahead. Really encouraging, but I mean, I'm not sure myself, maybe somebody else might be able to pipe in and give some input, but I'm not really sure who was around the table when that was put together. It certainly seems to be addressing some of the things which, you know, have been being put forward by organisations like ACAN and FAF, but and perhaps it was maybe a little bit pre-FAF. I think it was down in September 2020, wasn't it? So, but you know, we'd be really interested to understand who was around the table making those decisions, and you know, who should that be opened up to?
Yeah, I 100% agree with what Punya's just said. I think what for us was so important when we were having these conversations was, yeah, who is making those decisions and who's contributing to that architectural education? Because, you know, all of us here have raised that their education isn't fit for purpose. It's not covering all the points it needs to. And so why would you separate these things off into separate courses when the current course doesn't function in a way that prepares us all for practice and creates well-rounded architects who are addressing all of these important social and environmental issues? And so, yeah, I 100% agree with kind of Punya's sentiment. And what I really liked about our kind of collaboration on this is how, Punya, I felt you're very practical in your kind of thinking about it. So all of these practical thoughts, I feel like, come from you, whereas I was kind of more just like, get rid of the whole thing, start again. And so I feel like that created a really nice bounce. And again, this is why I think it's important having people in different positions, educators, tutors, people further along in their practice career, and people who are students or recent graduates involved in this conversation, because it creates that bounce and dynamism that's needed to create a more balanced and holistic architecture education.
Drop the mic.
I'm just writing this stuff down, guys.
That's it. We're done.
I mean, I'm going to open it up to the floor, you know, if anybody wants to sort of add to that. I will say, I think there's some conversation at the moment about, in terms of implementing more things into the education process, whether it is feasible to cram any more information or any more sort of stuff in an already very demanding course. Is that sort of possible within this broader mental health challenge and overworking culture that already exists? Might be good to discuss.
Yeah, so I'll come in on that, because I didn't have a sort of what you call conventional architectural education, because I studied architecture in India. Yeah, and I came here having finished my part 1 and part 2, and I did my master's in sustainable design, which I was the first woman to do it. And then I found I couldn't get work. So like many overseas students that come here and can't get work. And I turned into an activist because I saw what was going on. There was huge amount of discrimination against people who came from abroad, particularly those with sort of darker skin colors. And, you know, my friends in India were like amazed. They were saying, but Sumita, you are one who has studied sustainable design, you know, you're qualified in that. Why have you turned into all this activism? And, you know, but the moment you step into this country, you're not actually just trying to become an architect. You've also become an activist by the way of, because you're a woman, because you have a certain skin color, because you have a certain accent, because you have a certain name, and, you know, so on and so forth. So that's what I became. But obviously, you know, my first love is about sustainable architecture. And I have also taught students, for example, a hybrid course in architectural engineering, which was fascinating until it was like taken down. But what I want to say here today, which struck me as someone coming from another country and trying to practice here and teaching here and getting so involved in the RIBA, is that there's a complete disconnect between the code of practice, so the ARB and the RIBA codes of practice, and what students are actually taught. So just a simple example, one of the things they say is, you should know how to manage your money and resources, etc. I'm trying to find the exact one, but I think you'll find it. But where are you taught to do that as a student? Yeah, so there are so many things that you need to know in order to practice, which you don't know as a student. So you're completely unequipped to teach that. So what I want the RIBA, which validates the course in about, I think, 51 courses abroad and over almost 60 schools of architecture in the UK. That's a big number, right? And the RIBA has outposts in 115 countries. So whenever we're talking about education, we're just talking, oh, this is Britain, we're the center of the world, and this is how it should be done. And I think, what Preeti was saying about, going to Tanzania and not to Venice is equally important. How are we teaching people about cultural aspects of architecture, about decolonizing architecture, and about climate change? Because climate change isn't going to just happen in, like there's some kind of shelter over the UK, right? And we do all these nice things. We write these nice documents, like the Letty have written 2 documents, and it's so London focused, and so on and so forth. And I'm very critical of the documentation that's been written about climate change, particularly because it's so London centric or Britain centric. It's global. We have to think globally now. Act locally, think globally. That was, 1992. And we're still not doing that in education. We're still not thinking how to align practice with education. And things like inclusion charter. I mean, I don't know how many times I've told people, what does it mean? Inclusion charter, what does it mean to someone practicing in Malaysia? What does it mean to someone in the Middle East? Get over it. Just think of the RIBA as a global thing, as architecture more global. And no one's doing that. And that's why we are limited. We can't work abroad. We take students on these fancy trips, they go to India and do a bit of, go into a slum or somewhere and come back, and then they want to work with a star architect. And that's it, that's the end of their understanding of climate change, of equity and globalization. That's finished. So our education is not, put as a global venture. It is a very narrow thing that we're looking at.
And if I completely agree with what Sumiti is actually saying, and in a way, I mean, my experience, with when I was actually being taught and now is actually teaching at the LSA. I mean, I'm not saying that there's actually a perfect solution, but I think how they teach at the LSA is slightly different. I mean, they obviously actually, one of the things is the first year, the student will get placed working 3 days a week, and then they actually, sort of study 2 days a week. But I'm not just talking about that. That is actually quite useful, for the student. But in terms of the courses that we actually teaching is actually very, very different to what I actually went through. Because as we probably know, well, if you're actually London based, you in a London school, any of the London school, you choose a unit because you like the tutor, because of that's that topic is actually very fancy, and then you just love going to Los Angeles or whatever that you're being asked to actually fly to or whatever, right? Whereas actually, where we actually came in LSA is slightly different. I mean, one of the module that I think is the first time that I actually did it is we're talking about design cities. We're actually looking at the city, London as a city, and we're not even talking about architecture. We're looking at what's the issue, what's going on in the city. And then later on, at the moment, we're actually asking students to, well, why don't you actually write your own brief for your thesis project next year? So they are actually writing their own brief, what they will be designing next year as their project. So in some way, I'm just trying to say is, just like what Sumita is actually saying, is that how we actually teach and how we actually engage with the students has to be completely changed. You know, instead of this, I'm the star architect, you know, I'm this kind of great tutor, you know, I write my own brief because we're going to this exotic location that that I will actually give you all the brief, and then you just need to come up with a beautiful building, you know, anymore, is actually turning the other way around, is actually say, what do you, you know, student, so what do you want to do? You know, what is your agenda? What is your agenda? If your agenda is about climate change, yes, you know, by all means, you know, start actually doing all the research and actually say, this is going to be your own brief. If social or economic issues, that's going to be your main thing, you know, by all means, actually just do that. And that will be your brief next year for your, you know, for your degree project. And then that will define who you are. And because it's something that you will believe in, and also it's something that you can take with you, and then you can decide whether you want to be an architect, you know, or not. And I think that will be quite, I think this kind of mindset just need to change, you know, I think.
And also breaking this really narrow definition of architecture. Architecture is so much more than just buildings. It is cities, it is planning, it's sociology, it's politics, it's race, it's absolutely everything. And in education, the moment you get, and you know, I'm prime example of this, you get a working class kid and you let them write a dissertation on a topic they care about. They saw, I went from the bottom of the year to come in, you know, in the top echelon of the year group, purely because I found what I love to do. And I didn't think it was architecture, but a young PhD student who was a bit more radical decided to supervise me. So that is how we can actually diversify the people who are in this profession as well.
Yeah, but look at the prizes the RIBA gives. Okay, so you know, you might want to practice this particular type of architecture, and I also do that. I've actually come out the mainstream and I do my own thing. But if you look at the sort of work that's in the magazines, the sort of work that's given prizes and commended, that's nothing to do with the real world. And the thing is, the students actually aspire to that kind of thing. They want to build iconic building. We've got enormous problem with, you know, disasters. We've got problems with climate change. We've got problems with people living in shanty towns and slums. I mean, all those things need architects, right? And how are we enabling students to actually become experts in solving the real world problems? We're not. We're actually applauding this sort of very iconic, stylistic kind of building, very high energy kind of building. That's what we're doing. So unfortunately, again, you know, education and practice need to be aligned. You need to practice what you preach in the schools of architecture.
Just mic drop. That was yeah, reverberating words, Samita. We have a question. I think it's sort of related to what we've just been talking about from Julia Cabanas here. How do we address the fact that at student level, architecture is relatively gender balanced, but later on in our careers, women tend to leave practice? Architecture, both in practice and education, has a history of erasing women. For example, Denise Scott Brown being snubbed in '91 for the Pritzker Prize. It was Robert Venturi instead. How do we teach the industry and architecture education to make space for women, particularly BAME women, and to celebrate their contributions both in practice and in education?
So I can answer that, because I'm going to be teaching a course called, well, you know, I actually called it Women in Architecture and put it up on social media. And the next thing I know is people are saying, oh, well, there are loads of courses on women in architecture. And I started to look them up, and they were all about historic women, you know, the usual suspects. They were all mostly white women. And I thought, that's not what I'm teaching. I'm talking about a global view of women in architecture. I'm talking about, you know, different countries. And if you think about it, women are more than half of the world's population. And most of the world's population, what we sort of refer to as BAME, are actually, and minority people, they're actually majority people in the whole world, right? So you know, the BME are actually majority people, and we're not looking at the needs of BME women. Again, you know, I come back to this real world. Look at the world, look at it globally. So the course I'll be teaching will be actually about these sort of issues, and about how do women start practicing architecture. So I was chair of Women in Architecture many years ago, before setting up Architects for Change. And, you know, at that point, Women in Architecture group was a very different thing. They would get together and they weren't discussing the sort of employment issues and things like that. So I turned the thing around and said, you know, why aren't we discussing these things? Because, you know, at that point, there was 8% female architects. And now it's 28% architects. So it's grown 1% each year, which is not good enough. You know, if you want to get 50-50, so when you start out at school, you often get 50% or 40% female architects, female students. And then as you go down part 1, part 2, part 3, you're having attrition of female architects, student architects. And then, you know, so you're getting this very low numbers of women who are actually practicing as architects. So what we need to do is have people there teaching architecture who themselves are role models. We need to learn about women architects, a wide range, not just a particular set that people like to, you know, talk about. And we need to talk about different ways of practicing architecture. I think someone else spoke about it. So, you know, feminist practices, collaborative practices, collectives, you know, different ways you can support architecture. So all this is going to be in my course. But, you know, I don't think this is one school of architecture, but all schools of architecture need to do that.
Dana, you go first. I've spoken a lot.
Thank you. And I just want to build on that, because I think one of the things that we don't maybe talk about enough is leadership and management. So one of the issues for us as a sector is not only the very low proportions of women across the piece, but particularly in leadership positions. So one of the reasons that I started Built by Us was because so many people, particularly women at the start of their careers, were saying, I can't see someone who reflects my experience or represents me in senior positions. You know, there's no one like that in the practice. We're not encouraged or seen as potential leaders. Of course, listening to everyone today and the people that I meet through what I do through our mentoring programs, I know the capacity is absolutely there to have better representation. But I think when you're looking at management and leadership across the piece, and it's something that we haven't really talked about today, and particularly in practice, it's poor. We don't necessarily get that kind of education during the process of being educated. And so many practices are doing this kind of, well, throwing people in at the deep end and hoping that they survive, rather than actually teaching leadership and management. So we get poor management within the practices, bias, which means that if people aren't reflecting their style, they think, oh, they can't possibly be leaders and managers. So I think it's a kind of two-pronged thing in terms of increasing the capacity and competency of managers and leaders in practices, as well as recognizing the leadership qualities of women. What I see far too often is women in roles where they're acting up, where they're doing a role which is basically a management role, but they're not called a manager, they're not paid as a manager, they don't have the job title. But if they're not there, that practice can barely operate, but they don't get that opportunity, they don't get the title.
Very thought-provoking statements being made, and I think the comment section is really reflecting how profound a lot of these thoughts are. So thank you, everybody. Just going to move on to the next question. I'm going to pass it to Zafir. It's not quite to do with the environmental concerns, but I think it's relevant to the way that STUCAN is set up and ACAN. And the question is from Anna. I've recently taken a role in outreach. What should be my first steps to reach more students from diverse backgrounds, you know, to encourage them to study architecture? And what I want to sort of pivot this question on is, you know, how do you, I think ACAN and STUCAN, you guys are really active in setting up places and engagement in specific towns outside of London and creating this conversation. How do you sort of logistically tap into those sort of areas and mindsets in a way that sort of helps you know, sustainability or racial equity and all of these sort of broader goals?
Yeah, sure. So I think a lot of it is to do with like, yeah, having like connections in different places to begin with sometimes. So what we have, I guess, through ACAN maybe is lots of like tutors who are like involved, a lot of professionals who like help with ACAN, and then through that they have a connection back to either their old schools. So lots of the people, lots of the reasons that some of the student climate groups were formed is because of previous an alumni of that school as part of ACAN, and they're like, oh, I wish I had that, or I wish we had some kind of collective voice to do that. So then normally they get involved and help in the setting up of that particular organization. And I guess maybe to answer the question as well, as I guess start as young as possible to get as much like diversity. I guess similar to what's being discussed is that it starts really low down, and then suddenly when you get to the top, like that's the end, you just see the same like typical like sort of person, which is, yeah, really troubling, I guess, to see that kind of like 50-50 split for women and men at like a really young level, and then get to 28% or even worse as you get really high up. And I think it's the same thing for diversity and ethnicity as well. Like at Manchester, for example, where I went, it was really diverse. We were told in first year that there's a 50-50 split between internationals and UK, which I thought was incredibly impressive, like considering. And then, yeah, and then when you look at like masters or even like professional practice, when you go into work, it's almost like quite a shock that it suddenly like disappears. Like, where did everybody go? And yeah, I think it's just tackling people as low down as possible and kind of widening opportunities. And I guess like what Claire was like suggesting earlier about going to schools, I think that's also really important, is like even earlier than university, these conversations need to be happening, because I think even before you get to university, loads of people don't even realize it's a career choice. Like I know the RIBA does the architecture ambassador. I don't know if people like know about that. So that's quite a good like national schools program where like a practice goes and gives like 3 sessions with schools. That's something that I've done, and it was quite interesting to do because we went and like asked these students like, what do you think an architect is, or have you even heard of one? And most of them say no. And it's just like, just by that one act of just going there, and it was like to I think 60 children year 5, and by the end like all of them like were so interested in the amount of things that you could do, but just because you've never come across it, it's like just not even thought of. So I think, yeah, tackling people as like low down, like young, as possible is, I guess, the key to widening access in all aspects.
What do you think? I'm just on this. I think a lot of RIBA and sort of, I think older generation people sort of wonder, you know, how do we tap into the young people? How do we sort of make sustainability cool and sort of, you know, not to greenwash, but sort of how do you tap? I know, you know, we see commercial companies, you know, doing this, right? Things are greenwashed and sustainability is pro, and they know that it's a sort of zingy thing with young people, particularly. What would you say to those types of people in terms of how you relate, you know, with your cohort and your sort of basically constituents, right?
I think that would also be just to listen to the young people, because I think that they just, yeah, they're a lot more flexible, and they've got a lot more of the adaptability to like make this change and see the change. Like sometimes it's just not even being aware of what the possibilities are. And again, I guess through ACAN and STUCAN, something that's become quite apparent, because I guess it varies in unis, but some of the student groups have got quite a lot of interest from the tutors. Like some of the tutors want to join the student groups because we need this, like we agree that we should be involved in this. And then some of them have also got regular meetings, like and like Sheffield, for example, the tutors meet quite regularly with the student groups. There's like quite a good dialogue between them. And then Sheffield is really well known for the sustainability, for example, that they do. So that I think is like quite an important thing, like make sure that you like kind of encourage that kind of grassroots activism from young people, but also making sure you engage with it. There's no point in having it and not listening to maybe what they have to say and what they've been finding out. It's just it's a bit redundant if you don't maybe take that on and listen to what people are saying and doing.
It sounds so simple, just listen. Yeah,
can I just
yeah.
add, I think as well as actually, from the grassroots, that when you're talking about, having diverse people, as well, is people at the top. It needs to change. If you want a diverse, industry, we know that is actually beneficial to the whole industry, and is always and that's what I actually see. We can't be what we cannot see. So, I mean, even as a personal experience, as a person, with Chinese heritage, when I graduated, I didn't actually see anybody who is actually in senior role within the architecture industry, and yet you can actually see it is almost kind of comical that every single kind of major social issues, notably, let's say Black Lives Matters, or every time that AJ actually start having all these stories about diversity and inclusion, you will see practices who will quite happily actually post it, making statement to say we're extremely diverse, we are very inclusive, we are diverse practice. And you only just have to go to the website and look at the people's page. They are more than happy to actually to have their all their nicely choreographed photograph in there, and then you actually just see, well, all the directors or all the senior associate, they are all white. And then when they actually, what they really mean by when they say diverse is all the part ones and the part twos, they're actually ethnic minorities. So, it's the hypocrisy, of that. And it just, recently that went to a webinar that's I think is organized by the RIBA, I can't remember, now. And then we actually have quite a few directors, from well-known practices, and I actually type in one of the questions, similar to this, and say, well, how come we don't have a diverse, leadership, at the top? I mean, the question that I ask is, well, either is only two possibilities. Either, let's say, ethnic minority people, either we lack something that we can't make it to the top. In that case, fine, tell us what it is, and then we need to improve, on that in order to make it to the top. If that is not the case, you can promote your ethnic minority staff tomorrow, and problem will be solved. You can do that tomorrow. So that is actually not, so it's either one or the other. And I'm just getting a rather ishy-washy, to say, oh well, it's not as simple as that, because some of the ethnic minorities, staff that we encounter, they don't actually want to actually go to the top. They just want to be an architect and design. And I just think that's just a lot of nonsense. Are you actually saying, people from Asia, or whatever, all the Asian architects or whatever, even in Asia, they just want to design buildings and they don't want to be a manager. That's just not true. So, if we don't actually change from the top, the kids from the bottom, they might actually come into profession, but they will never actually be to stay in the profession, because they could just see, well, I can't actually make it to the top. Why should I bother?
And just really quickly to add to that, and in the name of intersectionality, class as well. The very first thing I heard on my first day at architecture school is architecture is a very middle class degree. Ha 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 ha. Immediately I was alienated, as well as minority people feeling alienated by the process and being unable to access roles of authority. Class plays a huge role in it. If you look at leadership, it's a gentleman's club. It's a white middle class male gentleman's club.
For sure, and I just want to add.
There.
No, I was just going to add, actually, from my own personal experience, just to add to what you were saying, is that you can't win basically anyway, because I've had experiences. I'm privilege is intersectional too, right? I have privilege in some ways that I speak with a North London received pronunciation. That has benefits sometimes, right? But you can't win anyway, because I've had meetings where people will turn around to me and say, no offense, but your face doesn't match your voice. Like, what am I supposed to do with that information? Should we talk about the door detail now? And so it doesn't matter. And I think I just wanted to add to that, because it was sort of personally poignant. But I'm just focusing on the time. We only have 4 minutes left officially. We have loads and loads of questions, which unfortunately we're not going to get to. But I love the fact that you all did show your best extroverted selves in the Q&A and the comments. There's some great comments about fame female architects and minority as a potential sort of group to look at, to add to the Marvel Assemble roster of heroes, and also highlighting from John Watkins that the RIBA council elections and RIBA associate seat are available for representation. Nominations close at 5 p.m. on the 10th of June. And at that, I want to sort of recap and just go around the table and say, how do we functionally, as people, as architects, as agents, begin to really change this paradigm? Pretty, you want to go first? You're just on my screen, so that's where I'm.
I think it's about harnessing collective power. As individuals, it's really hard to break a system, and echoing the principles of like anarchy, like we all come together, multiple small revolutions, have a very consistent and cohesive group response, we can change the world essentially.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that and say I completely agree, and I think it's also sort of understanding everyone's strengths as individuals, but also as organizations, and who you're able to best target. And, I think certainly when we were thinking about who was going to speak at this event, we're bringing hopefully a real cross-section of different people within our profession. And if we can do what Pretty said and keep working, collaborating together, working on each other's strengths, then yeah, I'm also hopeful for the future.
I could jump in next. Just want to say thank you for inviting us to participate as well. It's been really stimulating conversation, and I just wanted to add to this last part of the session to encourage undergraduate students to participate in conversations with their universities, to start, so they can start to understand what the structures are in the universities, and how they can start to bring about change. I think it's really important that we, from the discussions that Jasmine and I had I think we really felt that undergraduate education is where the greatest change could happen, and the greatest impact could be felt.
Most definitely. Kind of. Oh, sorry, Dana.
No.
Just off the back of that, just following, about our conversations, I think, and I've seen this myself with kind of the work we've done at Sheffield, and I think sharing your collective power has been discussed, and not just putting on the problem of that certain group. It's everyone's collective responsibility, and it's everyone's problem to care about these things. And I think in general, we have a bit of a crisis of care in university and within the profession, and I think this kind of collective empathy and collective power together are two really important things, and really harnessing those, especially at undergraduate level, because I think, and something we spoke about a lot, me and Punya, is kind of, and I felt a lot in my education, is that it was very passive in a lot of ways. People aren't studying in an active way where they're critically thinking about their education. And so I would just encourage anyone who's listened to this or watches it on YouTube, please start to think critically about your position in this profession.
Excellent stuff. And I'd just like to add, because really we don't get a chance to do it, but thank you to the chair and to the organisers. This has been a great event. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope everybody that's watching and listening has taken something from it. One of the things I'm constantly learning is the multiple ways that people are engaging in the conversation, whether they are setting up networks, whether there are advocates, whether they are doing in terms of setting up programs, which is what Built by Us does, as well as working with industry. Keep going. It's not a one-size-fits-all or one particular solution. We actually need this kind of multitude, I think, of solutions that are both internal in terms of the institutions and existing organisations, as well as people who are able to start a conversation, rattle a cage, annoy people. I think, as Charlie said as well, all of it is needed. Keep going.
Go for it, go for it, Vic.
I just very, very quickly, because I probably talk quite a lot, just picking on Dana's point, that I think if anyone who's sort of architecture student, you think, just try to think, as Charlie, full credit to you and the rest of the team, as well. I mean, you're literally starting from asking a very simple question on social media, and the amount of collective power that you actually gathered in such a short space of time, that must be actually making the, whatever we call it, the establishment, getting worried, because you're literally using something very, very existing tool with a very, very simple message, and you galvanize quite a lot of people. And if the Architects Journal, if you can actually get Architects Journal to actually, run their articles, on you, and actually talk to the RIBA, that is an amazing kind of power that you can actually generate. And you should just keep going. And as Damon said, just make a lot of noise, and people will have to listen to you. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I guess kind of going off that, the thing that I always hope that people take away from events like this is not only the part where you try and change something, or you think you have a solution, or you try and take action, but the preliminary part, which is simply organizing. Organizing in of itself, even before you actually do anything, is so powerful, both in terms of building collective power, like we've said, but also, educating yourself on the topics you want to address. One of the things that blew my mind the most in the short time that FAF has been running is how much I've learned between the first day that I spent 10 minutes making a logo in an Instagram account, and a month later when I'd ended up talking to hundreds of people. I went from knowing next to nothing about the RIBA, who were at that time our primary focus, to knowing probably more than I wish I ever knew about the RIBA. So, and obviously that's my instance in the focus that we had. But I think that ability to learn and develop as an activist, as someone with critical thinking and autonomy in your context, so much of that can just come from organizing and creating these structures with other people, and that's before you even end up doing anything. So yeah, that for me is always the thing that I'm really hopeful that can be replicated by many other people, hopefully.
I would agree with that. I think learning is maybe the ultimate outcome of this collective action, and I think events like this are obviously really great to have, because it just increases that kind of mentality for it, and it brings people together, because ultimately that's, I guess, what this is for. It's a multifaceted problem, and it needs a multifaceted response, and it's really great to work with organizations and just to become aware of organizations. I knew some of, I guess, the speakers today in the organization, but there are some who I did not at all, and it's really good to start those conversations and engage, so you can tackle the specific problems that you are focused on or that you would like to address. So I guess that also rolls into a massive thank you for organizing this, because it's been great, and it's been great to meet you all and to speak. So thank you very much.
Okay, am I the last one to speak, or I don't know?
Last but not least.
Last but not the least. Leaders always speak at the end. I think someone said that. So I'll try that, and you can have the last word, Rachel. But anyway, I just wanted also to put a plug in for Asian Architects Association, which Ming and I have started along with Tumpa, who was also started FAME, which is the female ethnic minority architects. I always forget which way around it is. But and then there's Vinesh and there's Carl Mork. So we all got together and set this up. So there's a little bit of plug for that. You can find us on social media. Just type in Asian Architects, you'll find that. The two things I want to leave you with is something I've been sort of saying all along, which is about acting locally and thinking globally. Please don't forget that. If you want to make an impact as architects in the world, please think globally. And then finally, keep the pressure up. you know, FAF got together very quickly, and you've been amazing in the kind of pressure. It was like, you know, for 20 years, we're sort of going around and nothing's happening, and suddenly FAF comes around. And, you know, even my son, who's not actually studying architecture, he'd heard of FAF, and he said, "Mom, have you heard about FAF?" "Oh, yes, I have, actually." And so, you know, there are lots of people who are hearing about FAF, which is wonderful. And, you know, about keeping the pressure up, don't forget that you have a political place as well within that. So, I mean, I was really disappointed at the last RIBA election. I know someone's just mentioned it in the chat, but less than 7% of the students voted in the presidential part of the election. And, you know, you had the whole opportunity to make a change and put people in who were going to actually do things for you. But, you know, so don't forget that you have that, you can make an impact in that angle as well, from that angle. So 2 things: keep the pressure up, don't stop, and act locally, think globally. Thank you very much.
I just want to say thank you, everybody who has participated and prepared. We love the memes. Everybody's loved the content and the memes, and the discussion clearly has been very provocative, and I hope successful and insightful. Yeah, thank you very much to the attendees as well. We know that it's, you know, this is beer o'clock, particularly now that the sun's out. I hope none of you are listening on your desk, still working. Yeah, and just to say that, you know, revolution begins at the dinner table. So send your memes, talk about it, you know, keep your calls to arms. Let's change the world. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, FAF.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.